I am really honored to introduce Bo Burlingham, and his new book is everything that Brad said it is and more, and I hope Bo will say a few words about that. To me, one of the most impressive things about Bo is, besides the fact that he's been closely associated with Inc. magazine for many, many years, he is not some high level theorizer. He is about being out there with people, talking to real people, finding out what they really do, learning their lessons and sharing them with others. The most impressive thing is the length of his marriage, which is 44 years. You need to update your online bio.
Yeah, right.
44 years. I think in today's world, that is a major accomplishment and something to admire him for. So with no further ado, let me give you Bo Burlingham. Applause, please.
Bo?
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Joel. Oh, okay, great. Well, when Brad asked me to come, very flattered that Brad asked me to come and talk to you guys. I was here a few years ago, and I have to say that of all the conferences I go to, this is definitely the one with the smartest people. It's a little intimidating. He said that, Brad told me that, he said, look, it'll be fine. You get up there, you're going to be a big relief after Mark. I didn't really understand what he was talking about, but now I do. And I'm going to, as Monty Python said, and now for something really different, I want to talk to you about the things really that I learned in the course of writing this book. It took me a long time because when I started out, I knew absolutely nothing about the subject. As Joel was saying, I've actually been at Inc. magazine for about 32 and a half years. And did I lose? Okay. I started there in 1983, which some of you may recall was a very interesting period in our business history. It was really the whole beginning of the entrepreneurial revolution. Some of you are too young to remember, but there was a time when it wasn't a compliment to call people entrepreneurs. It was an insult. But that was beginning to change, and it was changing partly. I'd like to think that it was changing partly because of Inc. magazine, but mainly it was changing because of the people themselves. And I had the great benefit to be there and to get to know a lot of these people and their companies when they were still pretty young, like Steve Jobs at Apple, Bill Gates at Microsoft, Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, Ben and Cohen and Jerry Greenfield at Ben & Jerry's, and so on. And during the times that I've been at Inc., one thing we've written about pretty much every aspect of the business process but one. We've written lots of stories about starting up businesses. We've written lots of stories about building businesses, handling your finances, managing people, and so forth. The one thing we didn't write very much about was leaving your business. Having written Finish Big, I am now shocked that we had this oversight. Because, in fact, it turns out that, number one, leaving your business is a lot harder than starting your business, and it's a lot more important. If you start a business and you fail, what do? You go out and start another business. If you spend 20, 30 years building a business and then it gets blown at the end, that is a huge, huge life event. Let me tell you how I started doing this. As some of you may know, I write a column in Inc. magazine with a guy named Norm Brodsky. That's Norm. He used to have a a record storage company, one of the largest independent record storage companies in the United States. And that's him loving his boxes. We started writing this column in 1995. About 2006, he came back from a conference and said, and told me that he had received an offer to buy his business and that he was seriously thinking of accepting it. Well, I found this shocking because he'd always had such a good time running his business. I thought, wow, maybe we should write about this. So we talked to our editor, and sure enough, we began writing a series of articles called The Offer, and every month, in as close to real time as possible, we talked about what he was going through, what was happening with this deal. This turned out to be extremely popular with our readers. We began getting tons of email from readers advising Norm about what he should do. It wasn't so popular with the prospective buyers who would sit in meetings and some contentious issue would come up, and they'd sort of sit there, and then they'd say, well, if I tell you what I'm about to tell you, is it going to wind up in Inc. magazine next month? But in any event, we went through it, and I realized that deal didn't happen. Eventually, he did sell the company. And I tell the story and finish big. But what I realized was, given the response of our readership, that there was a real hunger out there to understand what was the experience of actually selling your company. What was it like to go through it? And number two, that there wasn't really anything else out there that would tell you that. I mean, if you Google startups, if you Google finance, if you Google any other aspect of the business process, you'll get millions and millions and millions of hits. If you Google exiting, you'll get far less, maybe a tenth to a fifth of the number of hits, and almost all of them will be about how to sell your company for the most money. There's nothing there about what it's really like. So I went ahead, I talked to my publisher, and I decided, okay, I'm going to write a book about this. And the first thing I realized was that I didn't know anything about it. So what I had to do was to go out and interview dozens and dozens and dozens of people who had sold their business, left their business, what have you. And what I discovered was that about half of them were pretty happy with what had happened, and about half of them were totally miserable. It didn't matter how much money they had gotten out of the deal. They wish they hadn't ever sold their businesses. They said it was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. And I thought, gee, that's pretty interesting. What's the difference between the ones who had had good exits and the ones who had bad exits? And so that sort of set me off on a path to try and figure out the answer to that question. The first thing I had to do was actually there's a handout around here someplace, so you might see those. What exactly is a good exit? And I came up with 4 or 5 criteria. Number one, people feel they've been treated fairly during the exit process and appropriately compensated. 2, they have a sense of accomplishment. They can look back with pride on what they've contributed to the world. Number 3, they're at peace with what's happened to the other people who've been on this journey with them, their employees mainly. Number 4, they've discovered a new sense of purpose outside the business. And for some people, not for all people, it was very important to be able to see that the company was going on without them and was doing better than ever. So I said, okay. So I set out to try and figure this out. And I wound up, in the end, I came up with a number of different things. The first thing I realized was that most of us have the wrong idea about what an exit is. We think that it's an event that happens at the end of a business journey. In fact, it's not. It's a phase of the business. And there are actually different stages to it. You know, you have the startup phase, you have the growth phase, you have the mature phase, and you have the exit phase. And these are the 4 stages. Ping Fu, who I know that a lot of you know, is a friend of a lot of yours. She was the one who helped me understand this, because I started to talk to her about how important it was to begin at the end. She said, I don't understand what that means. How can you start with the end in mind? And I began thinking it through, and I realized that actually she was thinking about it as an event rather than as a stage. So the 4 stages of an exit. The first one, most people don't go through them. Most people skip straight to phase number 3. But there are actually 2 stages before that which are critical. Number 1 is the exploratory phase, where essentially you're educating yourself about, what's going on, what is this all about, what are the things I should be thinking about, and so forth. The second stage is the strategic phase, where you're building into your company the qualities that are going to allow you to have the kind of exit you want. The third stage is the execution stage. That's where most people start, and it's a big mistake. And what they do is they call up a broker, they call up an investment banker, and they go and they sell the business. And then there's the hardest stage of all, which is what happens when you actually leave the company. Because most people are totally unprepared for that. So I looked through this, and the other thing I discovered is that most of us have the wrong idea about business. We think, and particularly the whole journey, we think that in order to that if you build a great company, and I'm talking here, and I write about private companies, if you build a great company, the exit will take care of itself. And in fact, the opposite's true. If you build a company that you can someday sell for the most money possible, you will have a great company. And I'll explain that a little bit. As I said, I was looking for the factors that distinguish these, and I came up with 7 and a half, actually. But I'm going to focus on a couple of these because I don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions or comment. By the way, let me ask you, has anybody in here ever sold a business? Great. Well, when I get done, I'd like to hear from you. The first and most important one was something that I also found in Small Giants, and I've come to believe in the time that I've been writing about businesses, it's the most important thing, certainly for entrepreneurs, but actually for everybody. And that is that you know who you are, what you want, and why. Basically, if you haven't figured that out, by the time somebody comes along and makes an offer you can't refuse, you're going to find it out. You're going to find out that you don't know the answer as soon as you do the deal. It's also true that you, as I found with Small Giants, you'll also be able to make better decisions while you still own the company if you know who you are, what you want, and why. This is something I think you could argue that all of us spend most of our lives trying to figure out, and often it takes a bad experience for us to really begin to understand who we are, what we want, and why. But it's critical. The second one, and I'm going to talk about this because Brad pointed something out to me earlier, that you need to build a business that's sellable. And when I say that it's sellable, I mean that it can be sold when you want to sell it, to whom you want to sell it, for a price that you consider a good price. Sellable doesn't, most businesses, in fact, are not sellable. The Chamber of Commerce has done a study that every year of all the companies that are put up for sale, 20% get sold, which means 4 out of 5 people walk away without being able to do a deal. In fact, there are a lot of companies that never even get to that point. So it's even worse. But selling a company is not just about finding a buyer for it, because the nightmare for every entrepreneur, or at least what should be the nightmare for every, aside from having all their intellectual property stolen by the Chinese, the nightmare is that something happens and they wind up being forced to sell. This is for somebody who's in the business of buying companies. It's called a forced sale, and this is what you look for. Are entrepreneurs who are in a forced sale situation. For the entrepreneur, it's usually a tragedy. And it happens often for all kinds of reasons. The third factor was, and it's really the third and a half factor, is that you give yourself enough time to do it. And when you talk about all 4 stages, I'm talking about you actually, this is something that is going to take years. And the more ambitious you are about your company, if you're building a company that you want to last after you, the more time you're going to need to do it. Fourth factor was the importance of getting advice from the right people, which is the best advice I've found is always comes from people who've actually been through it themselves, and basically people often who've made all the mistakes that can teach you what you need to avoid. The fifth factor, you do right by the people, you do right by your employees. I can tell you stories about people who, years and years after they've sold their companies are still torn up by the fact that their employees were not treated well afterwards, or that their employees felt betrayed by their decision. 6, you have to understand why it is that somebody actually wants to own your company, because that's the only way you can actually anticipate what they're going to do with it once they own it. And the 7th one is that you figure out and become fully engaged with whatever comes next. Now that's the hardest one. I've just gone through those 7, but I'm going to focus on a couple of them. The first one has to do with sellability. When Brad talks about how, when he read the book, one of the things he walked away from was, and he thought would be relevant even to those of you in the room who don't own companies or not company owners, is that once you understand what it really takes to build value in a company, a lot of things that companies do become understandable. I said that I noted before the importance of building a company that is able to survive crises that might put another company in a situation where it has to be sold. I'll give you the example. There's a guy named Basil Peters who's in Vancouver. He's an engineer like you guys. He went to the University of British Columbia. At a certain point, he realized that he had gotten all the money in loans and from his family that he could, and so he better figure out how to earn a living. He was about 30 at that point. And he was interested in satellites. He thought that satellite telecommunication was going to be a big deal. This was, back in the early 1980s, late 70s. And he and his partner came up with a design for what's called head-end equipment. And that is the gizmo in a cable box that takes the signal from the satellite and turns it into something that can be sent out over a coaxial cable and into your living room. They started this company, and it was extremely successful. And he began getting lots of money for it. He became the most eligible bachelor in Vancouver, and famous and so forth. Everything was going along just fine. Until he got a call one day from one of his biggest customers, who owned the biggest cable news franchise in Canada, and who said, "Look, whatever you hear in the next 2 weeks, don't worry, I'm going to pay you." Well, Basil said, okay. And then he got another call from another customer saying, "Don't worry, we got some problems now, but don't worry." Well, it turned out began to do a little research, and it turned out that what was going on here was that there was this big savings and loan crisis. And the savings and loan crisis, the savings and loans had been some of the big purchasers of junk bonds, and all of these cable companies were getting the capital to grow from the sale of junk bonds. But suddenly, because of these problems in the junk bond market, the junk bonds weren't selling anymore. He didn't really understand this, but everyone was telling him not to worry. So he went to his bank and he told his bank, "Look, my customers are going through a little problem here, but they say not to worry." The bank accepted that for about a year, and then he wound up in the special loans department. These are the guys with brass knuckles who have no sense of humor. And he was desperate because basically he had never given any thought whatsoever to exiting or to how to prepare his company so that someday it could be sold. And he and his other people who he worked with, they racked their brains. It was at a time when, at the end of the Cold War, and defense companies were looking for other ways to make money, and he thought, well, maybe we'll find a defense company. He made, basically, and I write about this in the book, every mistake in the book when he did this. I counted 12. It was a miracle that he didn't lose everything he'd worked for the previous 17 years. The only way it was it's finally one of his board members said, your biggest competitor is Scientific Atlanta. They might be interested in buying them. The challenge is to get word to the people who could actually make a decision about this. This was pre-internet days. Wasn't that they couldn't just send off an email, but it turned out that somebody knew somebody at Scientific Atlanta who was high up in the company, and that they could probably get word through them. So the question was, this is what the old days were like. The question was, how are they going to get that person to deliver the word? And the guy said, fine, but I want $10,000 in cash. Literally, they got a bag full with $10,000 in cash, gave it to the guy. He told his contact at Scientific Atlanta, and sure enough, Scientific Atlanta was real interested, and they came after to buy the company. Now, there's a whole lot more to this story that I don't have time to go through, but believe me, it reads like a novel. Because while all of this is going on, he suddenly discovers that his venture capitalists are trying to undermine this sale any way that they can. And it's one thing after the other. Finally, at the end, he makes every mistake in the book, and the last mistake he makes is when he's sitting at the table. They finally got the deal, and he's about to literally stand up and go and congratulate everybody on this wonderful deal, and the head of the delegation from Scientific Atlanta says, oh, by the way, there's one more thing. This is something you do not want to hear at the end. And in fact, what the one more thing was, they said, by the way, we want Peters to come with the company. Well, now Basil Peters had been very careful up to this point to make it clear that he wasn't coming with the company. And he had plans of what he was going to do. But there he is at the table, and he's looking around, and there are all these people looking at him saying, yeah, sure, Basil, he can go with the company. Well, he said, I couldn't at that point. What could I do? So I said, yes, I would come with the company. The point is that and he did, and it wasn't actually it was, in the end, looking back from today, it wasn't a totally wasted experience, because he became one of the leading experts on how to do a successful exit. He's got a blog, and he learned it all by making literally every mistake in the book. And those are the kinds of people who you want to have advising you if you're in a situation where you own a company and you want to figure out how to sell it. I think that what I write about in the book is that really the best way to build a great company is to learn how to look at it through the eyes of the most finicky buyers in the world. And the most finicky buyers in the world are private equity people. You should do this even if you never intend to sell to a private equity person. Because the private equity people, their livelihood depends on making good decisions about companies to buy. And basically, what you realize is that every buyer looks at a company, and there are two things that they need to be convinced of. One is that it has the potential to grow in the future, and the second is that the negatives that might prevent it from growing in the future are as small as possible. What that requires is a level of discipline, of financial discipline, that most privately owned businesses don't have, but some do. I tell a story in the book about what it takes to create a culture of accountability in a business. And for those of you, Brad and I were talking about this, for those of you who work in companies and who are asked to do things to meet certain numbers, and it's mystified as to why can't people just okay, well, we're a little off. No, you have to meet those numbers. It's because that becomes key to building the value in the company so that someday this company will be sold, or this company will be valued at its peak. A company that is able to consistently meet its number year after year after year with a minimum amount of surprises is a company that a buyer is going to look at and say, that's a company that I can have confidence in if I buy. Now, the second thing that I also want to talk about the seventh thing, and then I'm going to open it up for comments and questions. But really, the last one on this list, I realized, is the trickiest part of a business exit, and that is what happens after the deal. The problem that you get into is that you get so focused on the deal that you don't think about what happens after the deal, and then you go and you get your money, and for a few months it's really fun to have all that money. You go lie on beaches, and then it hits you. Wait a minute. Who am I? What's my purpose? But there are so many people who I talked to who said the question that they hated most after they sold their business was when they would go to a party or something and people say, well, what do you do? And they wouldn't know how to answer that question. It was like, well, they don't want to say, I used to have a company. They come up with something, usually, but it's an awful feeling. And what I realized in looking at these people is that there are an awful lot of things that we get out of business that we're not aware of. Most of us are not aware of until we don't have them anymore. Purpose, our sense of purpose, our sense of identity, who we are, our tribe, the people we spend time with, and who look up to us because of what we contribute. Our sense of accomplishment. One of the great things about business is that you get these measurements that tell you how you're doing on a regular basis. Our structure, in other words, knowing what we're going to do next. When you suddenly wake up one day and you don't have any of those things anymore, it can be profoundly disorienting. And people go through, it comes as a shock, even to people who think they're going to be prepared for it. There's some people for whom it isn't a problem, serial entrepreneurs who never get emotionally attached to their businesses, but most entrepreneurs, do get emotionally attached to their businesses, and when they suddenly wake up and realize that everything that gave them their sense of purpose and identity and so forth in the future is different or is gone. The ones who had the best exits were people who figured out, and I think that this really applies to all of us. They were people who figured out how to get back those things and how to do them on a higher level. If you talk to Basil Peters today, he will tell you, number one, he just can't imagine how he could have missed the whole thing about planning for an exit. But you also ask him, how is he doing today? And he'll say, I'm doing as great as I can and still have it be legal. And what he does is that he's basically helping other people, have good exits from their company. And all the people I talked to who had had good exits and were happy, were really happy afterwards, what they had in common was they were all helping other entrepreneurs. And I began to think about it, and I said, what is purpose when we say we have a purpose? The question is really, who are we serving? It's about service. And when you're in business, you're at least serving your customers. You're probably, or you wouldn't be in business, you're probably serving your family as well. You may well be serving your employees. For a lot of people, they're serving their communities. And all these things sort of come together to give you your identity, your sense of purpose, your knowledge of who you are. And they're critical. I guess this is the thing that has always interested me, which is, how do you have a good life in business? And I think that the understanding of who you're serving is absolutely crucial. And the appreciation of that in whatever you're doing, the higher purpose that you have in whatever you're doing is critical. And when people ask me, what should I think about? I'm getting ready to sell my company. What should I be thinking about? I usually tell them, think about who you're going to serve next. I will say that that's true of people who are employees as well. Retirement is fine if you can handle it. Most people can't. For the same reason that most entrepreneurs have a bad or that so many entrepreneurs have a bad exit. Now, I see we've got a little bit of time left, Brad.
So first of all, can I have a round of applause?
Yeah. Thank you, Brad.
So before we start taking questions, I want to underline 2 points.
Yes, please.
And they're both number 2 on that list. One, and this is why I bought the book for you.
Yeah.
And that's what it boils down to, because we had already picked our selections and we added this book because I thought it was so impactful. Whether or not you own your own company,
right,
understanding this financial responsibility puts clarity on the actions of owners that may make no short-term financial sense whatsoever. Why is my boss telling me not to make those sales now, let's move them into the next quarter? Why do we want to why not take the money? And it has to do with being repeatable and consistent and maintaining a financial integrity going over a long, steady period. And the other number 2 part is, regardless of where you are in your business, understanding what it takes to sell a business will inform you as to what you need to do to make a more successful business.
That's
and
exactly
that was a
right.
really key takeaway. I highly recommend the book. And with that, I will take questions. And Bob, you get the first one.
He's not going to ask a question. He's going to make a statement. No. During your talk, I've sold multiple businesses in my career.
Yeah.
As an attorney. And there are 2 types of deals: an all-cash deal,
yeah,
and then there's a payout.
Yeah.
Over a number of years.
Yeah.
You didn't make a distinction as to any of these things where those are involved. You want to comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I do write about it a bit in the book. And the other thing that I will say is that there are other books out there that focus on those kinds of things. But basically, what Bob's referring to is the fact that most of the times, if you're selling a business, your acquirer is going to insist, many times, is going to insist that you stick around, and that there are going to be contingencies which are enumerated, and a certain amount of the price is put in escrow, and the business, and it's basically the certain assumptions, based on certain assumptions that the buyer is making, and that the actual price in some cases, this is what an earnout is, then becomes contingent on the company continuing to hit certain targets after it's acquired. There are lots of horror stories about earnouts, and there's a fundamental, sometimes it works out, but there is a fundamental problem here, which is that as soon as you do the deal, all the incentive for hitting those targets is on you, and none of the incentive for hitting them is on the buyer. And, there's no getting around it. So the point is that if you can possibly avoid having an earnout, you should. Now, sometimes you can't avoid it. Sometimes it's the only way that you can get your money. But obviously getting cash is really what you want to do. I would say getting cash rather than getting stock as well. Bob, is there any comment that you want to more?
I generally advise my clients to try and do an all-cash deal.
Yeah.
If possible.
For sure. There are a lot of other technicalities, like whether or not you do an asset sale or a stock sale and things like that, and those are important. But what I'm looking at here is sort of the emotional side of this, and people who have been through it, I'd like to hear from some of the people who've been through it, will tell you that it's 20 to 30% the money, and the other 70% is emotional. Yeah.
Adam?
Hi, Adam Caper, Synchrony Innovation. So I come from the world of entrepreneurs and, Boston startups, and been on the venture side, the entrepreneur side, advising, all that good stuff. It seems that, and this is kind of goes to like a core issue of why people become entrepreneurs. So there's a premise in some of your advice, which is that there isn't sort of a higher mission or a higher purpose animating the business in the first place. So in other words, if your advice boils down to a lot of it to maximize enterprise value and by serving the market in the best way that you can, presumably that all works out, right?
Yeah, my argument is actually is that even if you do have a higher purpose, you should be aiming to do that.
So my question is, in your research for the book, what's the proportion, or what do you find the breakdown is between people who, did something for financial reasons or maybe ego reasons, or they discovered something, and people who sort of set out to say, no, I want to do X, Y, Z because I think it's going to make the world a better place, and in the process, I expect to build a big company and make a lot of money. So what do you in terms of the fundamental motivations? Because I think for somebody who doesn't have those higher goals, all of this stuff is really important to stop and think about once you become successful. But a lot of people start that way, right? So I'm wondering what your
Well, I guess what I was sort of trying to get at the end there when I was talking about service is that I have to say that most of the privately owned companies I know, people do have some sort of a higher purpose. Yeah, they want to make a lot of money, but they're also doing something that they think is going to be good and is going to be good for other people. And, I will say this, I look at a full range of motivations, and every situation is different. I mean, on the one hand, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Great Game of Business, SRC Holdings, Jack Stack. If you're not, you should find out about it. He's somebody who has always, the rule that smart business people have is that you should build a company as if you're going to own it forever, but you could sell it tomorrow. In other words, it's this sort of duality that you have to balance.
Too bad you couldn't have held that until to the last question, because that would be a great place to end. John's got the last question.
Okay, John.
It's more of a comment than it is a question. And just for background, I've sold 4 companies and bought 2. And in the selling side of it, what I've found the hard way is, and this may be in the book, I haven't finished reading your book, so if it's in there, I apologize, but I found that you also need to pay attention to where the buyer is going.
Yeah, that's
Is it?
number 6. In other words,
No, well, not why, but what is their health? What I've been disappointed about
I
with
see.
some of my sales is that the company bought us. We thought everything was going to be great, and they bought us because they were tanking and they were hoping we were going to bail them out.
yeah, I have actually there is a case in the book that's like that. I have a whole chapter that's called Caveat Venditor, which means let the seller beware. When you're selling a company, a lot of times you think that you're out there trying to persuade the buyer to buy your company, and you are not necessarily aware that the buyers are also selling themselves. They're selling themselves that they're a great company, that they think you are absolutely the best thing since sliced bread, that they just love the way you run your company, and not only that, they're going to adopt a lot of the things that you do. Most of the time when they do this, they're lying. And once the sale is done, they say, well, it's a little too complicated for us to do this. And no, as a matter of fact, we don't really need you around, and so forth and so on. So that what you really have to do is you really have to really dive down and do your own due diligence. They're doing due diligence on you. I think what John is getting at is that you have to do your own due diligence on the buyer.
Okay, we have you have a 20-second question and a 40-second response.
Okay, all right.
Brian?
Okay, this follows on to our discussions and what I was doing in D.C. a while back when you and I were at the Inc. 500. I'm going to be bold and suggest your next book title.
Please.
Second Act.
Okay.
How to discover what their next act is.
Yeah, I actually, in the early stage of writing this book, I considered writing that book because it's when you look at people who've really finished big and are now, I mean, people who've really done it, and I've got several examples in the book, but people who've really done it, gotten their money out, and then figured out what it is that they're missing from their company and how to get it back. They will tell you that I have a friend, Martin Babinek, who founded the company called Trinet, which some of you may be familiar with. They do employee leasing, things like that, especially for tech companies. And, since he left Trinet, he's still on the board, but since he left Trinet, he's now trying to revive the economy of upstate New York. He has a angel fund. He's started another new company. And I asked him, I said, Martin, are you having a good time? And he sort of laughed because he said, you really want me to answer that question? And I said, yes, because I know what the answer is, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. And he said, I am having a ball. Life doesn't get better than this. And, more power to you if you can figure out how to get there.
So another round of applause
Thank
for
you.
Bo.
Thank you, Brad.